Good evening, everyone. I'm Ted Everingham. I'm speaking to you from the Sheldon Room at the historic Alger House in Grosse Pointe Farms, Michigan, here on the shores of Lake St. Clair, which is looking autumnal tonight. It's a little cold out there, and we're expecting some rain. As I've said before on these programs, it's a good night to sit beside the fireplace and share ideas. And we have a fireplace behind me that's not functional, but we will be. During the course of the evening, if you're watching at home or your office or wherever you are, you're welcome to use the chat function to ask questions. We'll watch for those questions and relay them to our guest. The one exception will be Eddie Visco, whom you see on your screen. Eddie, would you wave your hand? Eddie is the associate director of the Gerald R. Ford Institute for Leadership in Public Policy and Service at Albion College, and he'll be asking questions, as I will, directly of our guest. And our guest is Thomas Henthorn. Thomas is the Wyatt Endowed Professor of Public History at the University of Michigan, Flint, hence the arch over his head. You can identify him by that. His research and teaching interests explore the intersection between public history and urban history. But for several years, Dr. Henthorn has been the primary instructor for the Early American History Survey course at U of M Flint. Hence the discussion tonight about Alexis de Tocqueville. He joins us also as the state scholar for the Michigan Humanities Museums on the Main Street exhibition, Voices and Votes, which will open here at the War Memorial on November 29. More about that as we go along. That's a very exciting thing for us. That's going to be exciting for everyone who can get here to the campus to see it. So with that, I would introduce you to Thomas Henthorn. Tell us about how did you get interested? You're a public history guy. How did you get interested in Tocqueville?
Sure. So that's a fair question. Right. So I got interested really when I saw several years ago, I saw a man named Bill Cook, who is now he's a emeritus professor from one of the SUNY campuses, State University of New York campuses. And he gave a presentation on the merits of Tocqueville and undergraduate education. He sold me on it. He sold me on it. There was as we talk tonight, hopefully one of the things that I try to impart about people is for a book that was written so many years ago, there's still a lot of things that we can learn about ourselves today as Americans in 2021 from Tocqueville. So after watching him, I just kind of started diving into Tocqueville and thinking about ways that I could use Tocqueville to talk about early American history when I teach the survey class. So if we all remember, for those of us who've been through a university experience, often that early U.S. history survey, kind of up until the Civil War, lots of people take that, not just history majors, but people take it just kind of for their own edification or for general education. So it's a great way to introduce a lot of really key concepts in American democracy to a breadth of students from a lot of different backgrounds and a lot of different interests.
So that got it started.
Yeah, and then from then I started to just introduce some of the readings, introduce some of the topics. When we kind of started talking about, I first started just kind of introducing just a little bit of it, when we would talk about maybe the antebellum era. But over the last several years, I've kind of broadened it to where really, I would have to say, a good 5 weeks of the course is us kind of talking about the development of a young democracy, the development of democratic society. And we spent about 5 weeks just kind of diving into Tocqueville and about the tons of different topics that he covers during his travels in his book, his 2-volume book, Democracy in America.
So let's talk a little, first of all, about who Tocqueville was. I remember crossing paths with him as a history major at Albion College a long, long time ago. But he was an interesting guy. He was sort of the Elizabethan man and past the Elizabethan era and in France instead of England. He was an aristocrat, a Frenchman, diplomat, political scientist, political philosopher. Today we'd call him a political scientist, historian, trained in the law, born in the early 19th century, as I recall.
Correct. Yeah. So Tocqueville was born in 1805. Right. And if we think about what's happening in Europe in 1805, this is after the French Revolution. This is during the Revolutionary Wars in France. All right. So Napoleon Bonaparte comes to power. And if we think about, and as an aristocrat, Tocqueville would have grown up and become an adult in a world that his parents just didn't recognize anymore. All right. France, from the society he came from, it was a relatively stable society, right? Basically, because it was built on the oppression of other people. So for aristocrats, it's a relatively stable society. And then you get into the 19th century, and then suddenly Tocqueville is coming of age in a very fluid continent, with not just war happening, but lots of political changes happening. And really prior to the 19th century, many people from Tocqueville's class probably could have spent most of their life seeing very few changes happen in their lifetime. And that's just not the case with Tocqueville. So he's really kind of interested about all these changes. And then he comes to America in the 1830s, really in 1831, and is studying our young democracy. And you're right, he's a lawyer, and he's trained as a lawyer, and he's actually working he worked for the French National Assembly. He worked for France's foreign minister, and he comes to the United States to study prison reform. That's the idea. That's the he and his companion Gustave de Beaumont. That's the pitch they made. So if we're thinking about in modern terms, if they're writing a grant proposal, right, their proposal is they want to come and study the different kind of reforms in prisons the United States is doing. And actually, I mean, there's a lot of kind of innovative ideas happening within prisons, in the United States at the time. So that's his reason for coming here in the first place.
And it's a remarkable thing because as an adult, he was living in an era that his grandparents, for example, wouldn't have recognized. Yeah. Because there were so many tumultuous changes going on in Europe, but in France in particular, with a series of revolutions. You got this monarchy and that republic, and then the next republic, and so on, throughout that period. And he came to the United States when he was, 26 or 27 years old, 25 years old.
Very young man.
And to study prisons, the penal system, and report back to the government, the then, what was called the July monarchy, as I recall. And Beaumont, I guess he was a lifelong friend. As I recall, he wrote some stuff too on interesting subjects that's kind of gotten lost because of democracy in America to Tocqueville's work, but he was writing about slavery in America.
Yeah, he wrote this really interesting book called Marie, and it was a story about slavery. I mean, and it's really interesting too, because I mean, race is something that Tocqueville actually covers a little bit in his in part of Democracy in America. But so Beaumont writes about this really interesting story about a woman who comes to learn that she is of African ancestry. And so, yeah, it's a really interesting story too. And you're right, it kind of gets drowned out because we tend to look more of at Tocqueville's work.
So we always think about Tocqueville as having come here to study democracy and report back to the people of France about how this all worked or didn't work. And that really wasn't his mission. When did his focus change? How did he come? I don't remember him right. I don't remember reading a book or reading about a book about prisons in America, but there are 2 volumes of Democracy in America, published in 1835 and 1840, something like that.
That's correct. Yeah.
How did that shift happen? How did he make that quantum leap from prisons to democracy?
So he actually does gather quite a bit of information about prisons. And there is a report that, he does actually have to tell the people back in France, the people that wrote the checks for him, he actually does have to deliver that report. So that, but you're right. I mean, there's, it's not one of these things that a lot of people have on the shelf of their library these days. But I think most of his ideas about democracy in America happen while he's here and while he's traveling. He travels all over what would have then been kind of what we consider maybe the settled part of the United States. He's all over New York. He spends a lot of time in and around New York. That was the kind of the focus of his original travels. But he travels up and down the Atlantic coast. He travels to what would have been that time the Great West, which would have been Michigan, and he actually makes his way to Flint, Michigan.
Really?
Believe it or not, there's actually not far from the building that's behind me, the North Bank Center. There's a plaque downtown that commemorates Tocqueville actually coming through Flint, in his travels. So as he's out and he's discussing and he's talking, he's gathering information about America, and it's because he's really kind of interested in it. As you said before, he was kind of, we didn't really have this term, but he would have been kind of on the cutting edge of kind of political philosophy and political science. It's kind of as it's developing into a body of thought. And he honestly thinks, and we know this before he comes here, that he thinks democracy is the wave of the future. So he wants to really learn about it as much as he can while it's over here. And what a perfect opportunity is while he's here to study and ask questions about this young democracy that the whole world is watching. So it happens, like I said, while he's here, he kind of develops these ideas, but he probably had a pretty good intent before he even came that he was going to ask more questions than just about prison reform.
Well, he was an aristocrat. He was a liberal thinker. It's a time when democracy is trying to come to the fore in France, with a little different than here because there was a monarchy and the people are rising to the bottom and the monarchy's coming down and they got to meet and it got pretty bloody. It got pretty bloody. So I can see the French people must have been saying, or somebody in France must have been saying, can this really work?
Well, this is exactly what Tocqueville was asking, right? And he wants to see, as a matter of fact, so democracy in America, even though we read quite a bit of it in American political thought, democracy in America was written for the French, right? So the his entire purpose behind that book was a French audience, to say, not necessarily to say, hey, we need to put these ideas in place here, but here's how democracy is working in America. Here are some of its strengths. Here are some of its weaknesses. Here's some lessons we can learn from it. He was under no illusion that that democracy, the way it worked in America, could work on the continent of Europe for the exact same reason. There's just a different kind of political legacy involved there. So they didn't have the kind of clean slate in a sense that they did in the United States. But that's exactly what he wanted to do, was to show people, well, here's how it's working somewhere else. What are some things that we can learn from this?
And what did he find in terms of strengths and weaknesses? What lessons would, studying democracy here, democracy was existing in a sterilized test tube. It hadn't been tried here before. It was brand new, clean slate, so to speak. What did he think about it? What were the goods and the bads? And we want to talk a lot about free speech and the impact of democracy in America on that thinking in those days.
Sure. So one of the things that folks always talk about is I shouldn't say always, one of the bigger topics that people tend to focus on with Tocqueville is the infatuation Americans have for associations. So they have political associations and they have local kind of voluntary civic associations, that America was a nation of joiners. And one of the things that Tocqueville talked about is all these different kind of institutions, some of them formal and some of them informal, where people kind of cut their teeth in political participation, right? And that's where they learn how to become members of a democratic society. So even something as simple as being the member of a church, or being the member of just a local, a local organization designed to do something like, clean up the town square once a year. All right, all those little kind of things right there. People take those, use those organizations as opportunities to learn about how to live and participate and work with one another in a democratic society. So that's a really great example. So he's got a whole section on political associations and a whole section on voluntary associations. And I think those are really kind of big themes that come through in a lot of different ways about how America affords people the opportunity to test the waters and be part of a participatory society like that. So that's one example, the associations. Another one is local office holders. He sees local offices, especially judges, right, who usually are lawyers, right? He sees those folks as really, really important. Local offices, local sheriffs and everything as really important of connecting people to local democratic institutions. So he sees those kind of, the function of local politics as really, really important, as opposed to a focus of, like in France, it's a highly centralized kind of government. So he sees this kind of federation, the way we have, if for those of us going to remember back to our political science 101, the marble cake federalism, right? The way local and state and higher offices all kind of work together. He sees people really, the entryway into that is local politics. And I think that's a really good example. If we think about, a lot of the politicians that we follow at the national level, they all kind of got their start on usually a local issue, right? So there's a lot of credence to that. One of the things I enjoy talking the most about with my students is what Tocqueville has to say about free speech. Is what you mentioned, and I could share with you some of that. I think what Tocqueville does is he's fascinated with how speech operates in the United States.
Yeah, talk about that some more, because I think my memory is, and I did a little refreshing of that memory in anticipation of tonight. He believed that democracy couldn't succeed without freedom of expression.
Yeah, that's exactly true. That's exactly true.
That included free speech, speaking out loud, the town assembly in New England, for example, and the things you mentioned. But it also included the freedom of the press. Talk about that a bit.
Sure. Yeah. So he saw press, and when he was thinking press, he was thinking specifically about newspapers, right, at the time. And newspapers had a pretty had a much different function than what we think of now. Is today we don't like the idea of a partisan kind of press, but there was no hiding exactly how partisan the press was in the 19th century. I mean, that was that's what its job. And you're right. The idea that the idea of ideas constantly being circulated in a public sphere, allowing people to listen to them, allowing people to enrich their understanding of what the issues are, and then of course allowing people to be able to engage and talk in that too. That was essential for democracy. So, and the press played a really important function of that.
Go ahead.
Oh well, and I'll tell you, one of the things that strikes me about freedom of speech is when he writes when he's talking to folks in the United States, he notices that despite all the freedom of speech, and I'll go a little bit into about exactly how much there is, he says he finds less independence of mind and genuine freedom of discussion in America than he does in other places visited. So I'll repeat that again: less independence of mind and genuine freedom of discussion. So as an historian, right, when I see some sort of contradictory kind of quote like that in the primary sources, that's when the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. And that's when you really kind of really dig into it and you say, well, what is he really talking about here? I mean, he goes to great lengths of noting how so many people are involved in political discussions, whether it's the press or whether it's the town square, or in the local public house. He even notices how women, to a great extent, even though they're barred from voting, are really part of this speech movement. So Americans are talking quite a bit, but at the same time, he sees that there's real limits on free speech too. And I always, and that's what I think is really kind of fascinating about Tocqueville's treatment of this and his critique of American, society and speech.
I remember phrases like the sovereignty of the people and the tyranny of the majority, which is a kind of contradictory thoughts as there was more, as society became more egalitarian, there was more equality among people. People began to all think you began to develop the people were sovereign. That was underlying all that we did here. And what he called the tyranny of the majority, where soon the majority shuts out all other ideas. And so the irony is that you start with freedom, you start with equality, and you end up with a kind of despotic government because everybody's thinking the same way. Does that contradictory, how does freedom of the press and freedom of speech work into that notion?
Sure, yeah. So Tocqueville actually talks about that specifically, and he actually talks about the majority itself. So when he's talking about freedom of speech, right, he makes the distinction that there's two different ways we think about freedom of speech, right? First of all, there's free speech that's as a legal concept, right? So freedom of speech enshrined in the Constitution itself, all right? And when he talks about that, that's pretty straightforward, right? There's not a lot of wiggle room there. But what Tocqueville talks about freedom of speech, he's talking about how it's practiced by ordinary Americans in the public sphere, all right? And that's where he gets into the idea of the majority. And he does make the emphasis that he does emphasize that freedom of speech has been fundamental to democratic society. Even back when you think about the ancient Athenians, they saw talking to each other, as citizens, as key to the health of their democracy. But the problem with speech is often that there are limits. All right, despite this belief in the freedom of speech, that there are limits in what people can talk about, and those limits are often placed there by the majority. So I've heard a lot of different people talk about different ways to think about this. You want to think about free speech as a big circle. My favorite expression was somebody who said free speech is a big tent. And the majority kind of sets the rules over what type of expression, what type of speech is allowed within that tent. And it's a pretty big tent, right? It's a pretty big tent. There's a lot you can talk about. But if you're too far away from the ideas of the majority, all right, if you're outside that tent, your ideas will get shut out completely. And that's that tyranny of the majority. So the majority can use their many ideas to bring more people in, to make the majority bigger, but they could also use it to very quickly squash dissent.
And so along comes the concept of freedom of the press, and I guess kind of freedom of assembly too, the associations you spoke about. That's kind of the antidote, is it not?
Well, it can be, yeah, it can be. I mean, one of the things that Tocqueville is concerned about is that that majority tends to be that majority, all right, that kind of prevailing idea about what acceptable speech is tends to be present in associations and tends to be present, in the press. And if you're outside that, you're basically the subject of kind of, not necessarily political violence, but, you could call it, intellectual violence. You'll be kind of disrupted. and just kind of not taken seriously. So I could share an example with you if you'd like. One of my favorite examples that I took. So a really good example is if you ever see pundits from the left and the right, you know, kind of go at it, a very easy way to make somebody to kind of suck the legitimacy out of somebody's argument is to call them a socialist. Right. So there, I mean, we may have some pretty broad ideas about how far to the left or how far to the right you go, but socialism's kind of outside that tent, right? And so if you label somebody as a socialist, suddenly all their ideas, none of their ideas have merit anymore. So that's a good example of the ways we do that. And you can see how that can happen in the press, that could happen with, you know, that can happen really just about anywhere of that idea. And it works the other way too, right? I mean, you would say the same thing if you think of somebody's if somebody's ideas are too extreme, you know, to the other end of the spectrum, there are plenty of ways you could label them to suddenly their ideas are no longer acceptable because they fall kind of, you know, outside that tent. And Tocqueville has real concerns about this. You know, he says he has real concerns about freedom of speech being lost in America if the majority becomes too powerful. And most importantly, if the majority kind of becomes centralized, you know, somehow, and takes away a lot of the ability of these kind of local grassroots kind of things that are constantly feeding democracy.
Let me take a kind of a break here to invite people to submit questions through the chat function of Zoom. We'll be watching for those, and we will relay those questions to Thomas. You might think, if you're home, what do you think about censorship? What do you think about what's happening with Facebook and the other social media these days? How does that all play into these ideas? What would Tocqueville have to say about that? Let me turn to my friend Eddie Visco at Albion College. And Eddie, do you have any questions you'd like to start to ask questions of Thomas?
I sure do. So first of all, thank you, Dr. Henthorn, for that very interesting introduction to Tocqueville. It's been quite a while since I read anything, probably since my freshman or sophomore years in political science courses. So I'm glad I got the refresher. So thank you for that. One question I have about freedom of speech, and I would like to hear your thoughts about Tocqueville's interpretation. Anonymity. I was wondering if you would think that with freedom of speech comes some responsibilities. So there you should have, you know, put your name behind what you want to say and how you want to express it. Or would anonymity be a way to kind of get a viewpoint across that would be against the tyranny of majority, as you put it?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I don't think Tocqueville, if I can remember correctly, Tocqueville doesn't specifically get to that issue of kind of hiding behind, you know, hiding behind speech. But, oh, somebody else had that question too. But I think if we want to think about, there isn't a lot of anonymity to public discussion in the 19th century. So the opportunity doesn't really, you know, come up. There's a return address on just about anything, whether you're talking with somebody face to face or whether you're doing it through the press or something like that. And there isn't, you know, there isn't that kind of anonymity. But I will say this, though, is that Tocqueville is very interested about people participating, all right? And, you know, really, and he sees participation, all right? And not just participation about going to the ballot, all right? But actually doing the grunt work, I guess you could say, you know, that makes a democracy function, which includes having discussions, which includes, you know, helping out, you know, in local associations and things. So I think he would be a little uncomfortable about anonymity, because in a sense, if you're too anonymous, you're not doing the work that he sees that's essential to democracy. I hope I'm not putting words in his mouth, you know, but that would, you know, so, but I think that's how he would kind of answer that question. You know, if you take a look at, and I'm answering it by thinking about how he understands how people are supposed to participate in a democratic society, and it's not from a position of being hidden or anything like that. I think Tocqueville would find that kind of not very productive. Great
Another
question.
question,
Good
another
question.
question, Eddie?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Eddie starts off with a hard ball. He's-
You knocked it out of the park, so thank you.
Try another one, Eddie.
Okay. So just like anonymity, I'm sure misleading information or fake news wasn't very prevalent when Tocqueville was writing. So I'm sure you have some thought about it. Should it be regulated? And if so, do the regulating in Tocqueville's opinion?
Yeah, so Tocqueville, I think, would be really very, very uneasy about regulating speech. So he sees he has some very specific things to say about the majority becoming centralized. So he would be very uncomfortable with coming up with regulations about that. And for one, is he seems to think that American culture already is putting quite a bit of regulation on speech as it is, especially when you compare it to other parts of the world. So he actually sees kind of political humor as not a lot of political humor. Americans kind of take themselves a little too seriously. But if you think about political humor in France, I mean, that goes back a ways, you know. I mean, there's a long tradition of political humor even under the monarchies. So I think he sees, again, he sees American culture already putting some controls on that, and he'd be very uneasy about codifying that, you know, and somehow that turns into something more institutional. And there isn't really, like I said, that term fake news, you know, isn't really floating around. But there is actually in the 1830s, you know, in the 1840s, we start to see the growth of more newspapers, right? Printing's becoming cheaper and easier. And then it really explodes 10 years later, right? So the proliferation of more media is really something that's starting when Tocqueville's kind of talking about this at the beginning. So I think maybe 10 years later, he might have had a different answer. Americans are actually in the 1850s are very concerned about the amount of media that's out there because, you know, the number of newspapers just grows exponentially in a relatively short period of time. Oops, you muted yourself, Ted.
There. I do this every time we do one of these. I tell people to unmute and don't unmute. I've been reading about Alexander Hamilton in the period of the 1780s, 1790s, which was before Tocqueville came to the United States. And the newspapers there, the fight between Hamilton on the one hand and Jefferson, Madison, Monroe on the other, they were just battling newspapers back and forth. And the truth was often exaggerated. I don't know the extent to which that sort of thing was still going on in 1830, 1835 when Tocqueville was here. But what would he, and the Federalist Papers was another example. Those were designed to convince people of a position, no question.
Sure.
What would Tocqueville say about that kind of journalism and the Federalist Papers?
No, he wouldn't have any problem with that. I mean, that kind of broad public discussion is exactly what the press, exactly what free speech is designed to do, right? It's designed to get a lot of people talking about an issue and trying to make as many people aware of an issue as possible as we think about how that issue sooner or later gets formed into law or an institution or some kind of policy. Remember, the idea is that you know, the public sphere, this place where conversations happen, is a good thing. And it's not only a good thing, it's essential for democracy to work. So the more people talking, the better, all right? Because that's more people that are participating. And again, in the 19th century, when Tocqueville's in America, he's witnessing these kind of discussions, these huge policy discussions. Really, you know, the biggest thing everybody's concerned about is let's think about our local bread and butter issues, right? Roads, schools, right? Things like that, you know, the basic stuff. This is exactly what everybody's really kind of engaged in. And he sees lots of people talking about these issues in the press, but then also, you know, in local public houses, in church meetings, and in town meetings. So again, more people talking, the better. All right, and it's an essential element.
Understood. What would you think about the social media? And there's been a lot of talk about social media um, uh, monitoring and excluding statements that are they believe to be provably false.
Yeah, so I mean, I think Tocqueville would be a little uneasy about it, but it certainly is consistent with how he says Americans understand how freedom of speech works in practice. All right. So it's not necessarily when we think about social media platforms, right? Social media platforms doesn't ban, there's a list of things that are acceptable, you know, within social media, right? Or there's a list of things the majority or the big tent lets people talk about. But if you start to post things on social media that are outside that, right? If you start to talk about violence, if you start to talk about things that undermine, you know, that's one of the ideas is I believe Twitter's was that if you undermine, you know, political institutions or something like that, people, people would say that that's outside the tent. So Tocqueville would definitely see all of these different kind of social media platforms and their policies as within, you know, that kind of cultural understanding about what acceptable speech is. And remember, this isn't the government that's making those policies. These are Americans themselves that are kind of coming together as an aggregate and saying, we don't want that kind of speech, you know, in this, you know, in this realm. So he would again, he would be troubled by it, but he would see why, you know, why it operates that way. And it would certainly be consistent with his understanding of free speech.
Again, if you have questions for Thomas, please submit them in chat. We'll pass them on. We've been doing that along here, and we'll continue to do that. I guess the question that I would have if I'm Tocqueville is, who's deciding what's right and what's wrong? What I think is right, you may think, or Eddie may think is perfectly wrong. And I'm more concerned about statements that are false, flat out false.
Well, I mean, even false statements, to an extent, you know, are acceptable. All right, even your false statements are. It's the false statements that again are the ones that are beyond the pale and fall outside of these, or move the conversation, you know, outside of what's acceptable, either far to the right, you know, or far to the left. I think part of the concept here too is that politics today, we often see it as kind of a form of combat. And Tocqueville would actually think of ideas, whether it's a good idea or a bad idea, whether somebody's right or somebody's wrong, that the great things about democratic society are that you come to an agreement, you know, you come some sort of mutual agreement that's beneficial for everybody, or not everybody wins and not everybody loses. But this kind of idea about politics as combat, Tocqueville would have been really kind of uneasy about, because it doesn't really kind of get to mutual ends. It's just one side wins and the other side loses.
I have another question to follow on that, but I'm going to turn to Eddie again. Eddie?
Thanks, Ted. In Tocqueville's opinion, are all voices equal?
Yeah, well, so okay, so in practice, no. All right, because then that's the power of the majority, right? Because the majority has a great deal of power. All right, and so whether the majority is right or wrong, the majority is the one that's really able to kind of set the terms. All right, and so in that sense, that's where you see these other voices where you can, and that's his concern about kind of the majority. And Ted brought it up more, the tyranny of the majority. That's where good ideas can get drowned out. All right, because since the majority kind of controls the terms of the conversation, all right, it's a lot. It can drown out other voices, even when some of those voices are good ideas. All right, not every voice that gets drowned out by the majority is something that falls out of the tent. They just tend to not agree with the majority. Remember, you're allowed to have all of these conversations, but sooner or later, one conversation will, one argument will prevail. All right. And Tocqueville's very concerned about the power of the majority to turn that argument. If the majority gets too powerful, those lesser those voices that I guess you could say aren't as vocal, aren't as loud, are not able to, to participate. And that's bad for democracy, right? Democracy needs experimentation. All right. That's one of the great things about that, by getting some ideas and throwing a bunch of different ideas on the table and jumbling them about and seeing what other kind of new innovations come about as a result of that, right? So that's key for the health of a democracy. And if you don't allow those voices in, democracy can stagnate.
Interesting. So you said early on, Thomas, you talked about the limitations on free speech that Tocqueville talked about. We slid past one of them, is what the Constitution says. Constitution doesn't prohibit me from saying anything. It says Congress shall make no law.
Right.
And that's been interpreted through the 14th Amendment and so forth to mean that there's state action required. It doesn't bar individuals from saying things. We all agree with that?
Correct.
And so what the discourse he's talking about when it's very healthy discussion, and it may be false, it may be exaggerated, is discussion among individuals. It's not, that's where the self-correcting nature comes into play. Not because the government says you can't say this.
Yeah,
That's
exactly true. Yeah, that's exactly true. So he's talking about all the different kind of social pressures that come into play that kind of regulate speech. And we can think about this, right? I mean, we've all been in a room where somebody's brought up an unpopular idea, right? and that idea quickly gets drowned out. All right. So think about, put that on a much larger scale. And yeah, so Tocqueville, remember, he's talking about the two different ways speech works in the United States. You're right. He talks about the legal mechanisms that encourage speech or that curtail the government from limiting your speech. And he says there's not too much to argue about that. It's pretty straightforward. All right, but that's what he's really kind of talking more about how how we as Americans ourselves kind of put pressure on one another. All right, and that pressure eventually kind of tends to curtail speech. And again, I think the more fascinating thing is, despite the tons of discussions that he sees people having all the time in all kinds of different settings, there's always that quote that always comes back to me where he actually says, he sees less freedom of expression in the United States, than other places, and it's always something that as an historian, you want to go back and you want to read it and you say, gosh, what's really going on? How is he able to say this?
Yeah, that fascinates me. And I guess that's something I'd forgotten about. It's just, I got to think about that a lot.
Yeah.
Eddie, you have another question?
Sure. And again, I apologize that I'm going to ask you a question that makes you interpret Tocqueville in a world that he had no idea was going to be coming to us. So, Citizens United, a court case that said, that we shouldn't place any limits on campaign finance donations because that's that would restrict freedom of speech. Do you think he would support what the Supreme Court justices thought on that opinion?
Yeah, I think he would have been okay with that. Again, so Tocqueville's really concerned about the limits of speech. All right, and he sees limiting speech as limiting participation. So now remember, we don't have the kind of corporations. All right, so when people were thinking about if you were going to explain to Tocqueville a corporation, It would have been a joint stock company that, that wouldn't have been that large, so this is even before, people like the Carnegies and the Vanderbilts and stuff created, new forms of wealth. So he wouldn't have, he wouldn't have seen it in a different light. But I think given what he knows and what his understanding was about the need to participate, I think he would have been okay with that, about making sure that political speech, regardless of what angle, where it comes from in society, that people are allowed to kind of participate and get in there. And again, remember, he specifically spells out that he's very concerned about the central administration, a growing kind of power in central administration within the majority. So he's really concerned about state action, something that would somehow manifest itself as state action that kind of determines free speech. All right, so anything that takes this majority and all the tricky rules that we use of the majority to limit speech, if somehow that gets turned into a policy, Tocqueville would be very, very uncomfortable with that idea. He spells that out very explicitly. He's very concerned with that.
What would he say today is the biggest threat in our country, 21st century, to freedom, loss of freedom? What's the threat? Free speech?
That's the big one. Wow. So, Tocqueville talks about so many things, he talks about religion and Christianity and democracy. He talks about more, I think he talks about, like I said, associations. He talks about voting. He talks about, there's so many different things that he thinks have to come together that make democracy work really well in the United States. So I would say that probably Tocqueville's biggest concern, and I'm going to try not to put words in Tocqueville's mouth here, but let's say this: were I having dinner with Tocqueville and Gustave de Beaumont one night, and I asked, I would probably come away with the impression that Tocqueville says when people stop participating on a local level, that's the biggest threat, because he always saw participation at the local level as training for bigger and bigger issues. All right. So that, I think that would be his biggest concern of where, and making sure that the people who are not just interested, but that people are trained to handle these issues. When he talked about the local level, he was really kind of thinking a lot about the role of lawyers and the things that lawyers can do to work at the local sheriff level and the local judge level and everything. So if he sees that element gone, then how do you get to the bigger issues if you don't even start, participating and engaging in democracy on the local issues? So that I think he would be very troubled as something that, that's something that he thinks people should really kind of keep their eye on.
So it's use it or lose it.
Yeah, and more importantly, it's not just use it or lose it, but it's use the things on your own doorstep or lose it. Is I think is what he would say. Those things that aren't several arms length away, but the kind of things happening, right outside your window. Those, if people cease to engage in those, then there's no chance to move on to the next level.
Eddie has a question that was submitted through chat by one of his students at Albion.
Good.
And
Good.
Eddie, I'll let you ask that on his or her behalf, and instead of me trying to read it.
Okay. Well, this comes from one of my sophomores, Emily, who is both a history and a political science double major, and also in the Ford. So also a great golfer as well. She's on our golf team and did really good this season. So Emily asks, going back to the question about who should decide on social media what is restricted, would Tocqueville believe that Mark Zuckerberg has too much control over social media and that his power to restrict freedom of speech on the sites he owns can go unchecked?
So I think somebody also had a little question there about kind of Adam Smith and everything.
Yeah.
So I think in the end, Mark Zuckerberg has a public he has to answer to, and those are his customers, right? So if we want to think about social media as people exercise political participation, basically through buying products, right? And I would actually argue that Mark Zuckerberg only has as much power as people are willing to, to pay for, all right? Or that people are willing to pay for. So in a sense, his policies are a reflection of the users. So I think it's difficult to take and put all these social media policies into one or two individuals. Because if they didn't have those policies kind of are the result of an aggregate of actions and an aggregate of what people want to see on these kind of platforms, because it is a product, that they're trying to sell. So I would say that, like I said, I wouldn't invest too much power in Mark Zuckerberg, because what would suddenly happen if, people decided to stop using Facebook? Mark Zuckerberg wouldn't, he wouldn't that much that power. So social media's power is really in the number of users itself. And those number of, and like any kind of commerce, the customer is the one that's really kind of deciding what that product looks like. And I would suggest that a lot of our social media policies are the result of what customers want, right? So Zuckerberg probably has, he does exercise, power in the sense that he's head of this giant corporation. But if he didn't have a product that if he started selling a product people didn't want, he wouldn't have any, any power at all. So I was kind of try to caution my students about how much power people like Zuckerberg, actually had. Living in Michigan, I think there's a great deal of hubris that comes with the heads of corporations, right? General Motors thought they could make any kind of car they wanted to. And it turns out that people would buy it no matter what, because what else are they going to do? And then that's not necessarily the case, so there is kind of some self-correction that the market does, I think, in social media and free speech, that can kind of mitigate some of that power a little bit. I hope that so if Emily is like any of the other sophomores I know, that's not an acceptable answer. I know that.
I met Emily. I met Emily. I'm sure she's listening with interest. So, and again, that's kind of the dialogue that goes on among all those people that are building that kind of self-limiting restraint on a Zuckerberg.
Right.
It's
right.
again.
Yeah. Go ahead, Ted. Didn't mean to interrupt.
Well, it's again about diversity of opinion driving, in this case, an economic result, but it's still the discourse of ideas.
Yeah, and I mean, the one thing to remember too is that Tocqueville doesn't really come out and say it, but one of the things that Tocqueville, and I think this is one of the things that Tocqueville would say that he would be concerned about now, is Tocqueville would be very concerned about orthodoxy, no matter where that comes from, right? Because no matter what conversation is happening, that the majority creates kind of an orthodoxy about what is an acceptable way to think and behave, and that. And so he's very concerned about about that kind of orthodoxy. He'd like to see that, because in a sense, again, he doesn't use this word, but we can see how orthodoxy has had a problem in European society for so many years, right? So he would be very concerned about the idea of orthodoxy, and too many people kind of, and just too few people, controlling what that orthodoxy is. And so I think that's one way to kind of think about it, and whether it's on the left or the right, there's an orthodoxy to political discourse, no matter what part, whether it's red, blue, purple, whatever, that there is an orthodoxy, and Tocqueville's actually would be concerned about that.
Eddie, one more.
All right, I've thrown you a lot of hard balls that you've hit out of the park, but so I got a softball to end. So in your studies of Tocqueville, what is probably the most interesting or fascinating or surprising tidbit of information that you've learned about him?
Yeah. So I think one of the things that's really interesting about Tocqueville is what he has to say. It's disappointing. All right. As enlightened as Tocqueville is, I was really disappointed in what Tocqueville actually had to say about race, and specifically about kind of Native Americans and African Americans. So he really kind of has a very traditional kind of Rousseau vision of kind of Native Americans and African Americans as kind of the noble savage. And so, I mean, in one sense, he's trapped as being a man of his time, but for being so kind of spot on and innovative about so many things in American society, it's really kind of a letdown when you get to his discussions on race and about Native Americans. Because he talks a little bit more about Native Americans. He actually devotes about 3 chapters to Native Americans and African Americans. And I think that's probably the biggest surprise, is that he had so many fantastic things to say about other stuff. And I was really kind of let down by how circumscribed his ideas were about race. And that really kind of did surprise, and that actually surprises a lot of students that I talked to, because they said, wow, he was thinking outside of the box on everything else. How come, what was his problem here? So I think that yeah, that's an easy one. That is the one that we often talk about and we often come back to.
That's a good question. I'd forgotten. That was kind of in the back of my mind, because in getting ready for tonight, I'd been reminded about those his writings about African Americans and about Native Americans, and just doesn't fit. Just doesn't.
Yeah. Like I said, it's very circumscribed by kind of these kind of very much European Enlightenment ideas about how smart Europeans are compared to everybody else.
Yeah.
So that's kind of how I've often seen his discussions on that.
Don't go away, because I got another question for you, unrelated to Tocqueville.
Oh, okay.
As we wrap things up here, Eddie, thank you very much for representing. I started to say your college, our college tonight. Eddie is the Associate Director of the Ford Institute for Leadership and Public Policy and Service at Albion College, whence he graduated some years after I graduated, many years after I graduated. Yeah, well, thank you for being with us. I mentioned earlier, Thomas, that you're the state scholar for the Michigan Humanities Museums and the Main Street exhibition, Voices and Votes, which is coming here. That's a fascinating job.
Yeah, so that's actually a really fun thing that I do. So one of the reasons that I was invited to this discussion is that Michigan Humanities sponsors this program called Museums on Main Street, where they send around the entire state of Michigan a Smithsonian exhibition. And of course, this one is Voices and Votes, and I highly encourage your members to get out and check it out. It's an unbelievable exhibit, all about democracy in America, all about kind of voting and kind of the uneven and twisted path that voting takes in the United States. It's not a direct path from from the colonial era to 2021, and people will really be astounded by the incredible documents and exhibits that they have for this. But as part of that, Michigan Humanities asks a scholar to come to engage with the different sites that host these as their state scholar, to talk about some of the issues around the exhibit, or whatever ways that we can assist with their programming. And as a result, I get to have conversations with you and Eddie and your members. And also when COVID's not happening, I actually get a chance to go all over the state. I've been to Pickford, Michigan, which I absolutely love. It's a small town in the eastern UP that I had never had a reason to go there. I've been to Morenci, Michigan, another town that I'd never have a reason. Hudson, Michigan, all these places that are just wonderful towns in Michigan that filled with wonderful people. People just love their hometowns and enjoy welcoming people to it. and enjoy having discussions like these all the time. So that's what I get to do, and it's definitely one of the high points of my month when I get a chance to do these things.
Thanks for sharing that. This is our final American Democracy live event for the fall of 2020. Please watch the War Memorial's website for our spring 2020 schedule of 5 Wednesday night programs, January through May, featuring new conversations on American history and democracy with authors, academics, and other experts. This winter, we'll visit again with some old friends while also making some new friends. Tonight, however, as just been suggested, was not the final American Democracy event of fall 2021 because the Smithsonian is coming to the War Memorial. The Smithsonian is coming to the War Memorial. The Smithsonian traveling exhibition that Thomas just mentioned, Voices and Votes, will be in our carriage house, a separate building here on the campus, from November 30th through January 8th. November 30 through January 8th. The exhibition examines the nearly 250-year-old American experiment of government of, by, and for the people, and how each generation since then has struggled with how to best form that more perfect union. Voices and Votes is suitable for all ages. It's an especially good tool for social study teachers, scout leaders, and parents looking for something worthwhile to do with the kids over the holidays, November 30th through January 8th. It's free. It's open to the public. We are asking our patrons to pre-register for times to visit through the War Memorial website. Keep watching that. Times to visit will be available Monday through Friday, 10 a.m. to 4:30 p.m. On Saturdays from 10 a.m. to 1 p.m. and we'll take Sunday off. We'll be closed then. Voices and Votes has been made available to the War Memorial by the Smithsonian's Museum on Main Street that Thomas just mentioned, in cooperation with Michigan Humanities, an affiliate of the National Endowment for the Humanities. We are flat out excited to have Voices and Votes here, the Smithsonian Traveling Exhibition, again, November 30th through January 8th. And Eddie, you might think about getting some of your students down there for that as they get back on campus or during their break. I hope you'll publicize that for us. So I, again, thank you, Eddie Visco, for being with us. Thank you, certainly, Thomas, for being with us and for getting me to renew what little I already knew about Tocqueville. I learned a lot in the last several days. I've enjoyed this immensely. A recording of this will be available on our website. I will send you, Eddie, and you, Thomas, a link to that so you can share it with whomever you want.
Great.
Okay. Thank you all. Thank you all for being with us, and good night.
Thank you.